My talk today draws from a book in progress called The Theatricality of Contemporary Autotheory, which argues that for reasons both ethical and aesthetic, autotheorists promote a form of relationality familiar to us from the theater, an embodied negotiation of partial identification amidst difference and separation. Autotheorists, I suggest, might well be described as theatrical thinkers. The theatricality of contemporary autotheory, and thus my talk today, does not attempt to make a comprehensive account of what many at this conference have aptly described as an unwieldy genre, one whose construction owes in large part, per Robin's point yesterday, to the way books are packaged and sold. It aims instead to offer, on the one hand, a pointed and, I hope, useful angle on the autotheoretical, and on the other, to use autotheory strategically to surface an important theorization of relationality by 21st century American minoritarian writers. The project is anchored by case studies of 3 broadly circulated 21st century texts, by now all referred to as autotheory, that many of you may have written about or at some point taught: Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, Claudia Rankine's Citizen, and Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. It frames these works as products of their micro-historical moment. Fun Home was 2007, The Argonauts was 2014, Citizen came in the middle, even as they call back to earlier eras of first-person writing and presage much that has followed. Joining the resources of literary studies and performance studies, the project brings textual analysis of these works, of theatrical dynamics present in these works and forms, together with performance analysis of their public lives and afterlives. A useful gesture, I argue, for a genre that so self-consciously produces intense scenes of address on the page, both on and off the page, that is. And we've had a little bit of that experience here this weekend. Here's one such scene. At a talk I attend in August of 2017, graphic memoirist Alison Bechdel takes the stage before a large crowd gathered at the Congregational Church in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. The night begins comfortably. Bechdel, whose memoir Fun Home is laced with psychoanalytic theory, notes the town's reputation as a favorite retreat for New York City analysts, and she says she feels right at home. In the Q&A following her lecture, however, things take a turn when a college-aged, queer-identifying woman takes the artist roundly to task on a subject of recent online controversy. The character of Allison in the musical adaptation of the book's National Touring Company has been given what some fans feel is a de-butched version of the original costume. In New York, lesbian actor Beth Malone wore a red Ringer t-shirt, not dissimilar to the t-shirt Bechdel is wearing in this picture here herself, and this is a playbill of the musical. On tour, the straight actor Kate Shindle is currently appearing in what this audience member claims is a more feminine camisole and button-down shirt. The young woman wants to know what Bechdel has to say to butch lesbians who feel betrayed by this failure of representation. The event suddenly crackles with intrigue and awkwardness. Bechdel is bizarrely being accused of failing her own butchness by declining to ensure an image for her onstage depiction that would allow some of the musical's fans to more readily identify with the character of Allison, which is to say, because Fun Home is a work of autotheory, declining to ensure an image that would allow fans to identify with her. No matter to Bechdel's interlocutor that the real-life cartoonist was actually not involved in casting or costume choices and played no role in the adaptation, no formal role, that is. No matter that the show's book and lyrics writer, the lesbian writer Lisa Crone, had already publicly weighed in on this very testily on the musical's website to confirm there was no campaign to de-butch the character. In her own defense, Bechdel shares with the audience that night in Wellfleet that Crone herself had asked for the costume change in order to better represent the essence of the character's butch identity for an actor with a very different body type. Bechdel then tries to clarify that the undershirt is in fact a white-ribbed man's tank top, pretty butch, I'm thinking, as a lesbian in the audience. Finally, she acquiesces, seemingly for the sake of politeness, to the interlocutor's near-tears insistence that it doesn't matter what kind of tank top it actually is. To quote the young woman, it looks like a camisole. What to make of this heartfelt misalignment between a reader's expectations for an autotheorist and the apparent interests of the autotheorist herself? And how does this somewhat spectacularly staged misalignment relate to what's actually going on in Fun Home and in other autotheoretical works? I pose these questions against the backdrop of a pair of questions from the conference organizers. When do expressions of subjectivity serve as modes of resistance to the co-option, colonization, or commodification of subject positions, and when as vehicles of it? And how might we develop modes of analysis of these phenomena that avoid reductive forms of denunciation or affirmation? I hear in the second question, in part, a frustration with the polarized perspectives on the first, particularly as they apply to auto theory. And I hope that my relatively zoomed-out focus on methodology for much of this talk might start to help to unstick us. As we know, auto theory's defenders, and to be clear, I'm talking here about critics, not about practitioners, but this is exactly the conversation to which Yasmina was alluding. In the critical conversation on auto theory, defenders embrace its frequent focus on marginalized subjectivities as a necessary rectification to gaps in the cultural record, a form with, quote, the power of giving voice to experiences and lives that are more often sidelined, discounted, silenced, and marginalized. That's Ariana Zwarchus in one of the form's early definitional essays. For such defenders, auto theory's formal and thematic intimacy can promote readerly compassion for minoritarian experience, a prospect whose appeal is yoked to the widely popular notion, and I'm most familiar with the US context, but ingrained practically from childhood in discussions of literature in the US, that literature's greatest work is to promote empathy. By contrast, detractors, and again I'm speaking of critics here, decrying what they see as the ineffective or downright deluded politicism of auto theory's inward gaze, argue that, as Merve Emery has it, quote, the neoliberal embrace of self-expression has become willfully misconstrued as, quote, a site of resistance. What strikes me as curious about the otherwise compelling positions of both of these camps, the defenders and detractors, is what they take for granted about auto theory. The corrective, urgent, corrupted, or downright boring, take your pick, immediacy of the form. By focusing on auto theory's purportedly confessional nature, both orientations overlook the fact that, especially in the hands of minoritarian authors, the form often thwarts expectations for intimacy, and with good reason, given the potentially appropriative dynamics at play. Consider the case of Claudia Rankine's best-selling Citizen. Following the paradigm of a glowing New York Times review titled How It Feels to Be Black in America, many critical and popular readings of this text have assumed the book's capacity to perfectly disseminate Black experience. As Evie Shockley noted at the time, the book's reception seems fundamentally linked to its perceived transparency. See, for example, its appearance on the New York Times bestseller list in nonfiction. Yet in keeping with Shockley's broader argument and with her beautiful talk yesterday, we must remember that to a significant extent, Citizen offers little optimism for communication's possibilities. Its characters, their scene partners, and the book's visual figures grow no closer to understanding one another as the work goes on. Indeed, it would seem that Citizen conveys, confirms, creates knowledge about bodily experience of racial injustice, in large part through scenes depicting the fundamental limitations of such knowledge. As when Rankine writes, the distance between you and him is thrown into relief, bodies moving through the same life differently. Meanwhile, at the level of form, Citizen works in myriad ways to disrupt readers' potential intimacy with victims of racial microaggressions. In Nick Laird's words, Rankine is, quote, continually wrong-footing the reader, swapping reference, mixing the physical and metaphysical at will. What kind of ethics might be drawn from a work that so diligently conveys the felt experience of racism, even as it seemingly dismisses the possibility for understanding within the pages of the book itself? An ethics in which communication about bodily experience has value, even if, perhaps precisely because, understanding isn't promised to all parties. Bechdel's character Allison ultimately draws a related conclusion. The cartoonist's famously belabored critical practice, and this is a photograph of how Bechdel constructs the graphic memoir itself. She decides what she wants to draw, sometimes inspired by a photograph of her family members, including her father, a main subject of the book. She takes a picture of herself posing in that way, and then she draws herself in that pose in the form of different characters, sometimes as herself, but sometimes as her father, a brother, a sibling, etc. So the cartoonist's famously belabored critical practice involves looking at, then performing as, then finally drawing image after image of her father's body as part of her quest to understand him. Yet throughout the book, across all her efforts to identify with her father, Bruce remains essentially opaque to her, and thus to us. In the book's penultimate pages, she finally admits that, quote, erotic truth is a rather sweeping concept. I shouldn't pretend to know what my father's is, which is rich after all of the time she spent trying to do just that. Yet though she doesn't say so plainly, she does become closer to her father through other aspects of her process. The time she spends with him in memory, the care she takes with his archives, and most of all, the extent to which her elaborate performance practice serves as evidence to her own commitment to creating a relational orientation to this flawed, beloved stranger she can live with. In forming my argument about what kind of relational orientation is modeled in and by at least certain auto-theoretical writing is a methodological approach to auto-theory that emphasizes the understudied dynamics of its theatricality, in addition to, but not subsumed under the more critically ubiquitous concept of its performativity. And I have to thank Robin here, who in edits on my piece for the Arizona Quarterly issue, finally wrote just that sentence in the margins of my essay, along with many other very useful comments. A theatrical approach to auto-theory offers critics three primary things. First, it sheds new light on strategies taken by certain auto-theorists to forestall cooptation of the subject positions outlined in their work, and this is what's most foreshortened in my talk today. Second, it underscores that because auto-theoretical writing implies its own performance, it can't be fully understood apart from scenes of readerly encounter, scenes that have their own embodied stakes. Investigating these scenes as incidents of rich local performance allows us to explore why auto-theorists' strategies to defray identification with them often fail. Finally, a theatrical approach renovates our expectations for what auto-theoretical writing may ultimately offer, on the page and on the stage, less the insights of one person's subjective perspective than the possibility of rehearsing an essential civic pose. That auto-theory holds such this was Bechdel drawing her father in a lot of different kinds of ways. Here you can see she draws him putting on makeup, she draws him taking photographs, and yet by the end of the book, she can't understand why he's done the things he's done, why he's left her, and more. That auto-theory holds such potential to get under our skin, provoking strong affective responses, whether positive or negative, makes sense in light of the fact that the genre turns out to draw so heavily on an art form, theater, that is even more obviously embodied. To quickly clarify, I use the terms theatrical and theatricality in a neutral fashion. In other words, I'm not suggesting that theater or theatricality is inherently progressive. Even as I propose we get curious about what artists working outside that form turn to the form to find. I invoke theatricality to describe embodied exchanges that unfold for an audience of one kind or another, that are set off spatially, emotionally, or otherwise from moments that precede and follow it, and that are crafted with some degree of intentionality on the part of one or more participants. In the text I address alone, and you may be able to offer examples from auto-theory on your own shelves, theatricality crops up all over the place. There's the methodological approach in which writers' own creative practices are shaped by theater, and I offered Bechdel's example there. I talk in the book's epilogue about Cathy Parkong's attempt, which she chronicles in Minor Feelings, to interrogate the racial politics of her own poetry career by literally transcribing the comic Richard Pryor's stand-up performances. And it's the effort of that transcription that ultimately sets her on the path to writing her first work of auto-theory. There's also the thematic approach, where theatricality is acknowledged to lie at the core of the writerly impulse, as in Rankin's description of Citizen as a book inspired by the choreographic questions: what happens when I stand close to you? What's your body going to do? What's my body going to do? In the formal approach, theatricality structures readerly engagement, as in the sly illustrated direction that scripts readers holding Bechdel's Fun Home into placing their own hands over the life-size drawing of Allison's hands as she grips a photo taken by her father. Finally, theatricality often attends at the level of narrative, as in the delicious game of cross-dressing discovered by a teenage Bechdel, the awe with which she viewed her mother's talent for the stage. Or Maggie Nelson's tightly scripted practice of injecting her partner with testosterone, offered as stage directions for the role of partner to a person in transition. Quote, I count the 4 rungs down on the blue ladder tattooed on your lower back. Spread out the skin, push in the nearly 2-inch long needle, and plunge the golden oily tea into deep muscle mass. Ju-Yeon Kim's invaluable work on the relationship between racialization and theatricalization illustrates the utility of this critical lens on minoritarian auto-theory. Both racialization and theatricalization, Kim argues, quote, rely on a productive tension between what could be termed, quote, the actor and the role, a doubling mediated by the eyes of others. We might add that the making and marking of gender and sexual identities function similarly, and that these identities often live on or in the body. As Kim observes, quote, theatrical performance makes explicit a tense union between the body or object that is present and the concept it represents. In contrast to art forms where the ideal might be more seamless integration, in theater, quote, the space between body and behavior remains a practical problem and a point of experimentation. In this light, it should not be at all surprising that auto-theorists look to theatrical aesthetics as an inspirational point of experimentation to underscore and/or revise the relational dynamics of identity-based performance. On the level of content, theatrical aesthetics contribute to readers' comprehension of intersubjective exchange as filled with failure, while also rife with occasions for granting close attention. On the level of form, they offer readers a script for encountering minoritarian texts that pairs an expectation of understanding's limits with guidelines for staying engaged. Joining a chorus of thinkers, including many in this room, who are invested in understanding auto-theory's stories of self as instead stories of others, I view auto-theory as a rich site for exploring contemporary aesthetic experimentations with ethical collectivity. Looking to the theatricality of this kind of work helps to explain the extent to which these so-called narratives are often all about other people, how hard they work, and we heard that yesterday wonderfully in Gabriella's description of the interviews that she's collected about herself from others, how hard they work to simultaneously engage readers and distance them, and in the ways their authors raise broader questions of public lives for their readers. Auto-theory's theatrical interests, I argue, are amplified and complicated by its sometimes quite theatrical forms of circulation. And here's where Robin's arguments of yesterday are so essential. This is a genre, if we want to call it that, whose form is imbricated with its modes of circulation in ways that render it unusually publicly made. And I'm always thinking of Julia's beautifully incisive description of theater as something, as a form in which the production, the circulation, the remediation are happening simultaneously. And this is unusually true for auto-theory as a genre of literature as well. Works of minoritarian, auto-theory, and my context here is obviously American, rank among the most heralded literature of the 21st century. Their narratives are staged in live lectures by their authors, in classroom discussions offering overdue inclusion of diverse perspectives in the canon, and in campus or citywide reading programs enabling different means of access to these often quite challenging texts. Auto-theorists are recognized as public intellectuals, MacArthur Fellows, Pulitzer finalists, Guggenheim winners, New York Times bestsellers, New York Books Critics Circle award winners, National Book of Finalists and longlisters, and winners of numerous other prizes and fellowships. They inspire adaptation to other media, including sometimes to theater. They even motivate public debate, with Fun Home regularly in the news as a book banned in certain communities. It's not uncommon for readers to come to the genre of auto-theory, as did college student Jahari Adusi, the subject of this viral news clip. She's caught here reading Citizen at a Trump rally. You might recall this back in 2016. She came to Citizen first because she wandered into a museum with a friend and heard Rankin speak. Then she bought the book. Then she went to the Trump rally. She felt bored, and she pulled it out of her backpack. Within scenes of writers performing with auto-theory, a striking disconnect can emerge. Robin has noted that when people talk about the Argonauts, the routinely unasked question is, quote, what's the relationship between the authorial figure and the narrator who speaks in the book as her? Nelson herself does take pains to mark this distinction, writing, quote, I edit myself into a boldness that's neither native nor foreign to me. But as performance theorist Richard Schechner writes, the actor in front of an audience no longer has a me, but has a not me. A double negativity which renders auto-theorists' public performances, and I'm back to Schechner here, quote, simultaneously private and social. So while many works of auto-theory diligently make efforts to manifest the practical and ethical challenges of identification, the producerial logistics and politics of identity at play in their circulation highlight a persistent readerly investment in the factual relationship between the eye on the page and the writer on stage. This means that in-person events with auto-theory can get messy. In the Arizona Quarterly issue, I addressed, for instance, performances with Citizen when Rankin seemed to reject the premises of her interlocutors' questions precisely because their quest for recognition was so obvious. A white woman in one instance, two young black women in another. Toward the end of one event I witnessed, she invited long lines of audience members to, quote, get their questions in the room, and then let their expressions of anguish and affinity hang in the air. Performance theorist Peggy Phelan notes that performance inherently, quote, implicates the real through the presence of living bodies. Kim, whom I quoted earlier, makes the related observation that theatricalization can make it difficult to tell, quote, which traits lend a reality to the performance and which ones exceed the designated role, challenging the truth of the performance or extending the scope of the role. And here I want to note that in the competing goals of feminist or Black poetics invoked in previous talks this weekend with respect to that the competing goals of feminist or Black poetics invoked in previous talks this weekend with respect to representation are also functions of theatricality, dismantling notions of signification while simultaneously depicting unrepresented experience. In other words, because the books themselves are theatrically inflected and because the writers perform so much in public, there's no getting around the fact that it can indeed be difficult in the heat of certain moments to separate the very public writer from her narrating subject, particularly when that subject has been staged within a text that gives such attention to embodiment. Put yet another way, readers can't be entirely faulted for how challenging it can be to ignore the felt experience and authority of their own embodied responses to work in this vein, even as that authority shouldn't be allowed to stand unquestioned. If the theatricality of autotheoretical writing is at once an opportunity for authors to emphasize new relational dynamics and part of what can make receiving those dynamics so complicated, it may still offer one more thing, a way to view what I earlier called these misalignments between readers and writers as still meaningful for civic life. To make this final point, I'll note that if my reading of auto theory is invested in interrupting a bias toward the generation of empathy as the most important mark of literature's value, it also extends feminist and Black theater performance critiques of a treasured perception of theater as most democratically valuable for the spirit of commonality it purportedly instantiates. And if I leave you with nothing else today, I'd like to underscore that while theater is often celebrated as an art form in which different people come together, it can more accurately be described as an art form in which people come together to feel differently from one another. Think what a weeping audience member does not share in common with the tearful character, with the working actor, with another theater goer who may or may not be in tears. Bechdel illustrates this phenomenon in Fun Home when she depicts her family in the audience at a Broadway musical, A Chorus Line. As one of the musical's male characters says happily of himself, "You are a faggot," teenage Allison and her closeted father gape for unlike reasons at the stage. At the theater, these discrepant perspectives are held and nurtured side by side. Their physical and temporal simultaneity is the whole extraordinary point. Importantly, discrepant perspectives circulating alongside a genre as public as auto theory have the effect of expanding auto theory itself. Among the critiques of the Argonauts is the extent to which, according to Somayer, the book occludes, quote, a Black and queer trans-feminist literary genealogy, attuned to the dynamics of labor and class that would better ground the queer kinship model Nelson is working to create. Other critics raise important questions about the potentially appropriative nature of Nelson's citational practice, particularly with respect to her partner's trans identity and experience. Still other respondents to the Argonauts, however, including Saidiya Hartman, take on board both critiques but center their own agency as Nelson's audience. One of the more striking pairings in the Argonauts occurs when Nelson proffers the revelations of Black arts movement poet Lucille Clifton's evocative poem Turning. I'm going to skip ahead here. Turning on into my own self at last, turning out of the white cage, turning out of the lady cage, turning at last, as evidence of what Deleuze and Guattari mean by their theory of becoming. Lending credence to the criticism that the Argonaut sometimes cites women of color in instrumentalized ways, Nelson ends the Clifton poem 3 lines early, omitting Clifton's more racially specific reference to turning on a stem like a black fruit in my own season at last. At a Barnard Forum celebrating the book with Nelson on the dais, Hartman points to this pairing as one she finds quite rich. She conjures a theatrical scene, Lucille Clifton and Deleuze together in a dance of becoming, and then cites Nelson, citing Clifton's poem. While she begins with the portion excerpted in the Argonauts, she then reads on through the end of the poem, reinstating Clifton's original triumphant reference to her blackness. She goes on to spend the majority of her reflections on the figure of the Black mother as, quote, the flesh of the Black asterisk I would affix to the words queer maternity, queer family, and names her desire to, quote, push this world inside the pages of the Argonauts. What I most admire about the Argonauts, Hartman concludes, is that I feel the work invites me to do so. In this sense, auto theory citationality summons relational performances that address the work's own limitations by instantiating more inclusive dialogic iterations. Especially with very public texts like these, I'm trying to say, any experience of their bookishness is inextricable from the live performances that signify in ongoing ways on their meanings. And it seems to me that, at least with respect to very well-known works of auto theory, we have a chance to bring debates over critical and post-critical reading practices down to earth by investigating the explicit link between the practice of reading and the practice of citizenship. To this last point, I'll end where I began, with Bechdel on the stage in Wellfleet and the young woman near tears. This charged live event encapsulates so much of what is interesting to me, readers about auto theory, if we allow ourselves to make the natural extension from the work on the page to its work in the world. Readers' overinvestment in mimesis as sameness, inspired in complex ways by the art's own interrogation of this concept. Artists heralded as the voice of a certain kind of experience, reluctant to take on readers who've invested their narratives with the representation of that group, and the negotiation of who has the right to depict and consume minoritarian experience. Sponsored by the town's public library and set in a church that functions as a central gathering place for vacationers and locals alike, this particular event also emphasizes the overlap between literary and civic community. The young woman's investment in a narrowly defined aesthetic for Funhome's Butch Lead may have been a bad reading of the books, and I would argue the musical's arguments about the ethics of identification. But it also functioned to enlist the rest of the audience in the always contingent process of theatrical meaning-making. Over the last 200 years, theatricality has become a term that in many contexts denotes falseness. We can distill the dead-end nature of this limited understanding by considering the frequent dismissal of politics as theatrical. Practically speaking, the gesture does little to help us imagine politics otherwise. Thomas Carlyle's original 19th century conception of theatricality, however, held a different meaning, and it had to do with making the connection between witnessing some civic activity and developing a new sense of one's relation to society. In Tracy Davis's gloss, quote, "The onus for instigating the theatrical moment is on the spectator, who, by failing to sympathize and instead commencing to think, becomes the actor." By virtue of the unsympathetic audience member's emergence in this lecture scene as an actor, I, for one, found myself commencing to think on my visceral pleasure as a lesbian viewer when the original Allison stepped on stage at the Public Theater in the Ringer tea costume, looking unlike any character I had ever seen on stage in mainstream theater, and very much like many butch women I had known and loved. I was also aware of my horrified discomfort with one member of an identity group telling another in public that her performance lacked authenticity, let alone a member of a group in whose inclusivity I have some stake, which paradoxically made me sympathetic to the student, and of my strong disinterest in such a limited conception of fidelity as an artistic goal. The event organizer in me was meanwhile flooded with protect the artist adrenaline. Where was the moderator's cheerful next question? This event reminds us that whether viewed in aesthetic or ethical terms, auto theory's theatrical dynamics render the genre's invocation of intersubjectivity intense and unstable. When auto theory draws on theatrical aesthetics to address not self or other, but the messier, more pragmatic issue of each other, it also activates what we might call a theatrical ethics, namely the opportunity to be responsible to divergent perspectives, despite inevitable failures of comprehension through the durational exchange of attention. What we get, if only we might look for it and learn from it, in auto theory is a surprising story of relationality between authors and narrators, writers and readers, and members of civic community. A reorientation toward democratic life at once more modest and more radical than we might expect. It's more modest in that subjects are figured as perpetually unable to understand each other, and more radical in that they find occasion, as we have found occasion here, to attend to one another anyway. Thank you.